warm welcome to this edition of Roundtable with me, David Foster. Almost within touching distance of some of the world's wealthiest capitals lies Yemen, where the level of suffering of its people has the UN calling this the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. And yet the conflict has disappeared from the front pages, if it was ever there. What's it going to take to save a population that seems largely to have been forgotten? Well, the bombs have been falling, the bullets flying for more than 5 years now in Yemen's civil war, and dealing with the casualties put hospitals under enormous strain. Now, what remained of a health system has broken down completely because of COVID-19. The number of deaths from that, it's feared, could well exceed those who've died in the war.
The world's worst humanitarian crisis is in Yemen, according to the United Nations. 24 million people, that is 80% of the population, are in need of humanitarian aid. Millions of children are among those on the brink of starvation. Recent alarming death rates from COVID-19 and cholera have exacerbated the crisis, leading to a collapse of public institutions like healthcare, water, sanitation, and education. The United Nations humanitarian chief has warned that Yemen will fall off the cliff without adequate UN funding, as this year only $800 million was raised compared with $2.6 billion pledged in 2019. Conflict erupted in 2014 when the Houthis overran Sana'a and much of the country's north, and further escalated when the Saudi-led coalition launched its military campaign in 2015. Thousands of Yemeni civilians have been killed in the conflict and gross human rights violations committed, according to Amnesty International. Numerous UN-sponsored peace talks have amounted to little, leading campaigners to ask, why hasn't more been done to help Yemen?
Okay, let us welcome first of all from Florida, Stephen Day, who's Professor of International Affairs at Rollins College and author of Global, Regional and Local Dynamics in the Yemen Crisis. We go to Sweden, to Gothenburg, in fact, where we say hello to Afrah Nasser, who's Yemen researcher, Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. And finally to Surrey in the UK, Sherine El Taraboulsi-McCarthy joins us from there, Senior Research Fellow of Politics and Governments at the Overseas Development Institute. We're going to take in a lot, all three of you. First of all, thank you very much for joining us. We're going to take in the humanitarian crisis, we're going to take in the security situation, what the international community is doing about it, if anything. But let's start. Afra, if I may, Human Rights Watch documenting they believe, I think, over 100,000 civilians dead in the war. How much worse has the arrival of COVID-19 made it?
So in Human Rights Watch, we're really overwhelmed with the volume of the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. When COVID pandemic began early this year, I was personally having a headache. I couldn't imagine what kind of disaster that could happen in Yemen, in a country which basically has no functioning healthcare system. And statistics and data collection in Yemen has been very, very difficult over the course of the conflict. So I knew that statistics coming about the pandemic will not be realistic or will not reflect how's the situation on the ground.
So would it be fair to say, as some have, that more people could die because of lack of care when they have COVID-19 than have already lost their lives in the war?
That will not be an exaggeration. I think that's is also part of the truth. The situation on the ground is very, very grim. Basically, everyone I am in touch with in Yemen is having whether some sort of strange sickness that they cannot identify. Testing capacity in the country is very, very limited. The healthcare system is by all counts, collapsed. The latest statistics show that there are about some hundreds of confirmed COVID cases in Yemen. But at the same time, the UN says that the rate of COVID cases in Yemen are 4 times higher than the global rate. And people, about 25% of those cases end up dying.
Can I go to, sorry to interrupt you there, can I go to Sherine for just a moment and ask, why is it that 80% of the country is in need of humanitarian assistance when over the course of the 5 years, so many billions of dollars in aid has gone into Yemen?
Because of a number of reasons. One is that Yemen's always had a food security problem. It's always had a food security crisis, which only got a lot worse because of the ongoing war. But you are right to say that the humanitarian response was big. There have been capacity issues in terms of their ability to access different regions and different areas of Yemen. There have been problems from within the humanitarian sector itself in terms of its ability to communicate and engage communities in various parts of the country. And so I think that it is a mix of contextual factors that have resulted in the current crisis, as well as a failure on the part of the humanitarian system itself to respond to the crisis.
And there are those who say that aid is being weaponized. What do they mean by that?
Aid has been and continues to be actively weaponized by different actors on the ground. It is being weaponized by the Houthis, where humanitarian assistance is being used by them to not only expand their control, but also as a means of surveillance to be able to control the population. This is not only the case in the north, but different political factions and political groups in the south have also weaponized and used humanitarian assistance in order to control the people.
So it's not just the Houthis who control the north, it's all of those involved in the conflict. We'll come back a little bit later and talk about the multiple actors that have been in Yemen over the years with this war. But Stephen, let me come to you now and talk about your book. In the introduction, it's written, "This is not the forgotten war. This is the unknown war. This is the ignored war." Why is that?
Yeah, this is a statement by retired American Ambassador Barbara Bodine, who served as ambassador in Sana'a in the late 1990s. And what she meant by that is that there is a long tradition within the American foreign policy establishment when dealing with Middle East issues to treat literally every issue, every problem that comes up in Yemen through the Saudi file, meaning that American foreign policy makers tend to privilege Saudi interests when it concerns issues that come up in Yemen. They consult with what the Saudi monarchy would like to see in the country. And Barbara Bodine was pointing out that leading up to the war, and certainly during the early years of the war, most American politicians simply knew nothing about Yemen. She in particular made this statement when she attended a conference that had as its theme Yemen, the Forgotten War. And she pointed out that you can't forget something that you never knew previously. So she and others, and as a scholar of Yemen, I certainly take this position as well. Americans need to learn much more about this country and recognize that it's independent of other countries in the region, and it needs to be taken seriously along those lines.
And we will come to why it is important in the region in just a moment. But Sherine, I'll come back to you in just a moment, Afrah, if I may. Sherine, is it this pro-American, as Stephen's suggesting, leaning towards Saudi Arabia that has led to that country, that kingdom, being taken off the UN blacklist, which it had previously been on for violating the rights of children in Yemen? It says it's reduced the number of airstrikes, it's not targeting particular areas, and the UN says, okay, fine, that's okay.
I think it's one reason, definitely, and it's also part of the difficulty to characterize the war in Yemen. Is it a proxy war? Is it an identity-based war, a civil war? And I think it's a mix of all of those together, which makes it really difficult, not only to understand the different actors that are part of this war and how to engage them effectively towards a peace outcome, but also how to understand the different roles that they're playing on the ground. And I think that, yes,
does this mean, sorry to butt in, but this is important to me, does that mean that Saudi Arabia is no longer violating children's rights, or is somebody now turning a blind eye to it at the UN?
No, it doesn't mean that because Saudi Arabia is off the list that the Saudi government or Saudi Arabia itself is not an active player in the current war. Within which capacity, I think you need to establish the evidence base for that. But we are aware of incidences on the ground where children are being actively engaged in the war, be it by the Houthis as well as by different political groups on the ground. And so, I mean, I think taking it off the list does not necessarily mean that it's not there, it's not actively part of the conflict, because it is part of the conflict.
No, we understand that, but it's not biased on behalf of either the United States or the UN, or is it?
On behalf of, I mean, I think as far as the UN is concerned, or as far as the US is concerned, or even the UK is concerned, I mean, the arms sale has continued to Saudi Arabia. I think that gets us into an area where there's a question about whether or not and to what extent there's an honest broker in the conflict in Yemen today. And I think that everybody that you've mentioned on the list is very much culpable in the ongoing conflict.
Right, so no innocent parties, quite obviously, in this. Afra, let me come to you. We were talking there about children being targeted or not being targeted, and whether they're being hit from the air or by shrapnel on the ground or whatever happens, they are finding it very difficult because they don't have any food, they don't have schools, they don't have proper hospitals, etc. So what is the scale of the damage being done to the young people of Yemen?
So you have half of Yemen's population, about 50%, are basically children. They're under 18 years old. So we see like the impact of the war immediately on this population. And there are like a wide range of violence, directed violence that these children are exposed to, whether direct violence or indirect violence. But I think you just mentioned about Saudi Arabia being delisted from recently the UN list of shame, and I think everyone in like all the warring parties in Yemen have blood on their hands. But the delisting of Saudi Arabia is the latest clear example of the impunity that the Saudi-led coalition will continue to have in this brutal war in Yemen, where civilians across the country, in the north, the south, the east, are not, are not protected, are enduring unspeakable suffering. I think it's very important to continue mentioning the war crimes committed against the children, the civilians, and I really applaud this program. I remember when your producer contacted me about 1 week or more ago, and I was very surprised. And I asked, how come are you like booking a time for Yemen when there is no breaking news? Unfortunately, Yemen is as David mentioned, is unknown or deliberately ignored. And it's very little chances that we can really discuss Yemen for what it is and discuss the war crimes committed in Yemen. So I really applaud your program. And I think it's very important to repeat saying all the atrocities committed in Yemen, from, like attacks against children or war profiteering, and using the humanitarian aid that is weaponized, as you said. It's very important to repeat saying this over and over again until we are heard.
Yeah, well, we must thank Anissa, our producer, for getting in touch with you on that subject. Stephen, let me ask you this. It's been said that Saudi Arabia on the one side with the Emirates as well, and Iran on the other side, want to use Yemen to broaden their influence in the Middle East. How would you do that?
I tend not to give a lot of credence to this idea that the war in Yemen is a proxy war. There's no doubt that Iran, as well as Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, have been playing a role in the war, with Iran backing the Houthi movement, the party Ansar Allah that was formed in early 2015. But the real dynamic of the war is among the Yemeni parties inside the country. I think, as far as Iran is concerned, they have found that using the Houthis and Ansar Allah as leverage, in a sense, over Saudi Arabia is a cost-effective means for them to have influence. It's a way of putting additional pressure on Saudi Arabia.
Let me just ask you this. Is it simply the geographical location of Yemen with Saudi Arabia on one side, Iran to the north, that makes it important for those two major countries to have control or influence in Yemen? Is it simply that they don't want the other one to get an upper hand in the country?
Well, for Saudi Arabia in particular, Yemen is of great importance. And this has been true since the formation in the 1920s and the 1930s of this version of the Saudi monarchy. Very famously, it is said that King Abdulaziz, on his deathbed, warned his sons about the politics in Yemen in particular. So there's this conception that Saudi Arabia looks at Yemen.
Stephen, I'm just trying to get at why that is the case. Why is it important for both Iran and for Saudi Arabia? Why?
Well, for Saudi Arabia, Yemen is the country on the Arabian Peninsula that is closest to the Hejaz, closest to Mecca and Medina. And historically, in terms of Islamic civilizations, the influence of Yemen, indeed even pre-Islamic civilizations on the Arabian Peninsula, the influence of Yemen was far greater than the tribes of the Najd region, which is where the Saudi monarchy originates from, in the northeastern part of Saudi Arabia. So the question for the Saudis is political stabilization. They're concerned about the possible influence that Yemen could have.
I get that. Let's move on a little bit. So sorry, time is unfortunately against us in this one. Sherine, I'll come to you on this one, and perhaps back to you, Stephen, as well. You talk about stability. When I was doing a program on this 4, 5, 6 years ago, I think it was, even before it became an official war, they talked about Al-Qaeda gaining some kind of foothold in the south of the country, close to fairly major oil fields there. We've got IS affiliates, Islamic State affiliates in the area. We have, as you mentioned, various other groups as well. How worrying is it for those countries other than Saudi and Iran that these jihadist groups could be using the chaos in the country to further their ambitions? Sherine, you first, if you don't mind.
I think it's definitely been a fertile ground for those jihadist groups because Saudi Arabia, despite the fact that it's got a shared history with Yemen, and a lot of Saudi businessmen are of Yemeni origin, right? Yemenis are known for that too. They're good with businesses and so on. I think that this is the war has constituted the perfect opportunity for terrorist organizations and jihadist groups to attract people to them, and to attract them to a war that would be against an external adversary. In this case, Saudi Arabia. And so the only path forward is some form of integral peace agreement that would combine all of those different parties and different political groups on the ground, bring them to the table.
And as far as I understand, there are suggestions of virtual meetings between the parties, that they're falling apart. There's been an attack by the Houthis in the last 24 or 48 hours or whatever on Saudi oil fields. They say they've hit one. It doesn't seem like the sides are following on from the ceasefire that ended not so very long ago. And we have Mark Lowcock here, UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, saying, the situation in Yemen catastrophic. The world has a simple, straightforward choice: either resume funding of the Yemeni operation and save millions of lives, or watch as the country simply falls off the cliff. Do you think that's going to happen, Afra?
I think it already did. I'm sorry to say this, but the country is effectively divided into, if not 3, maybe 4 and 5. The economy in specific has been dramatically collapsing. That is impacting the different, the different areas in Yemen, where we can see, for example, the real exchange that produced in the south cannot be used in the north, and vice versa. So I think it's we were also speaking just a minute ago about terrorist groups in the country, and I think one of the most disastrous impact of the conflict is the birth of so many militia men, so many militia groups. So if Al-Qaeda or ISIS used to be a threat, today we have a group of different armed groups that we don't know where they're getting their fund from. They're operating outside the control of the major ruling actors that we know or that are publicly known. So the country is just getting into this circle of chaos. And unfortunately, if there is no cohesive and comprehensive vision for how to find a political solution or a political dialogue that could really get the country back together, I personally think that we will end up seeing 2 Yemens or 3 Yemens.
Well, 2 Yemens there were until a generation ago. Stephen, let me come to that. The prediction of Afra there is that if it hasn't quite fallen off the cliff already, then it's pretty close to it. What will it take to bring it back? And is there any kind of plan to sort this out?
I agree with Afra entirely in her comment, and maybe I'll repeat what she said. The country has already fallen off the cliff. This is a country that has been in perpetual crisis for nearly a full decade, beginning with the events in 2011 when the Arab Spring revolutions broke out.
Afra did say that it had fallen off a cliff. I'm sorry to cut you short. We're coming towards the end of the program. And Sherine, I wanted to ask you, we mentioned when I introduced Stephen that in the foreword of his book, it said it was not the forgotten war, it was the unknown war, it was the ignored war. So what to the rest of the world, those people that have until now ignored it, will be the result of this chaos?
I mean, first of all, I disagree that it's in the unknown war. I think that once you say that it's unknown, then you remove the culpability and responsibility for the international system, right? And I think that it is responsible. There is a responsibility there for it, and it is culpable. It is an ignored war. It's deliberately ignored for geopolitical reasons, because of inherent interests of particular states.
I get that. We've gone into a lot of that. What I'm really asking is, what are the consequences of this conflict to the rest of us outside Yemen if it is not resolved?
If it is not resolved, it's as Afra said, it's going to be blood on our hands. It is going to be blood on the international system's hands, and it will add to the failure of multilateralism, which has been going into free fall for quite a long period of time now, not only in Yemen, but in Libya, in Iraq. I mean, you can look at different examples. So I think it would be really sad to see Yemen get into this situation, because I do see an opportunity here as well. I think you were talking about how it's fallen off a cliff. And I don't quite agree with that. I think that it's a country in a very serious situation. It's in a critical situation, but there are also opportunities, and there are pockets of hope and stability there that the international community can benefit from and can help support. Yemen civil society organizations, activist groups have been doing a fantastic amount of work, and all they need is a lot more support from us and from the international system.
Yes.
They haven't been able to receive it. So yeah.
I'm going to have to say thank you to each and every one of you. And I sometimes feel like I'm being unnecessarily rude, but I do need to move the conversation on and about. And Sherine, as we say goodbye, I will just note that if all the international community has on its hands is blood, and that's something terrible, then it is not going to be affecting it day to day. That is a matter for its conscience, not in terms of the practical reasons why it's being affected by the Yemeni crisis. And that may mean it's pushed into the long grass for some time to come, I fear. I want to say thank you to each and every one of you. We have brought it to global attention with this program, and thank you for being so fluent on the subject, a subject which I'm sure you wish, in a way, you didn't have to talk about. So thank you once again for being with us, and thank you for watching this program on the Yemen crisis. From me, David Foster, and the Roundtable team. Goodbye for now.